Hi there, everybody, and welcome to Radio Talks, Making Classical Music Inclusive. This is a community talk organized and hosted by WTJU, the University of Virginia's community radio station, on air at 91.1 FM and online at WTJU.net. My name is Brian Simalchik, and I'm a co-host here on WTJU of A New Sound, which is our kind of new music, contemporary classical music show that airs Wednesday evenings. And just before we get underway with this panel today, a couple housekeeping things. I think we're all in the Zoom call. We're all muted if we're not speaking. If you have questions or comments during the call and you're on here on Zoom, please feel free to write them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on those throughout the hour. And then just a plug for WTJU, our annual classical marathon starts on Monday, December 7th and runs a full week, 7 days and nights of classical music, 24 hours a day. All the way through the evening of Sunday the 13th. So you can check out a schedule on WTJU.net. It's a wonderful time of year. There's an amazing diversity of shows, all kinds of classical music and different announcers and voices coming in. So do check it out there. And if you are so moved, you can also donate on WTJU.net. All right, so I'm going to introduce our panel today. We don't have Adolphus Hailstork with us yet. We're hoping that he's able to connect here on Zoom in a little bit. That is our new world, connecting into Zoom calls, something none of us probably ever did 9 or 10 months ago. So before we get underway, I just kind of want to introduce our panelists today so everybody gets to know a little bit about the amazing things that you all do. I'll start with Reggie. He's up there in the top corner for me. Countertenor Reginald Mobley is highly sought after for Baroque, classical, and modern repertoire. Recent highlights include a tour of Europe singing Bach's St. Matthew's Passion with the Monteverdi Choir and the English Baroque soloists led by Sir John Gardner. He's a member of twice Grammy-nominated Ensemble Seraphic Fire and has appeared with the Academy of Ancient Music, Agave Baroque, Bach Colloquium San Diego, the Calgary Symphony, the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, the Seattle Symphony, among many others. He's not just bound by the conventional countertenor repertoire. He's also performed widely in non-classical music and is also devoted to social and political activism. And here in Charlottesville, we just heard him over the last couple of weeks as part of the Early Music Access projects, expanding the narrative, slave songs, and spirituals as early music, which was a wonderful set of program and a discussion there. So welcome, Reggie. I'm going to move to Judith Shatin. She is a composer renowned for her acoustic, electroacoustic, and digital music. Her music has appeared on more than 30 albums. She's had commissions by the Barlow Endowment, the Fromm Foundation, Carnegie Hall, and the Library of Congress, performances by the Kronos and Cassatt Quartets, the Da Capo Players, the Denver, Houston, Minnesota National and Richmond Symphonies, among many others. She studied at Douglas College, the Juilliard School, and Princeton, and she's the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor Emerita at the University of Virginia, where she founded the Virginia Center for Computer Music. So welcome, Judith. And then last but certainly not least, Miriam Gordon-Stewart, Australian soprano who has gained recognition across 4 continents for her powerful instrument and dramatic vulnerability, specializing in the repertoire of Wagner and Strauss. Described as a genuine singer-actress, she has performed over 40 leading roles at major opera houses, including the Sydney Opera House, the Hamburg State Festival, Deutsche Oper Berlin, Korean National Opera, and the Bayreuth Festival. She's also performed in concert with the Dresden Philharmonic and the Lisbon and the Symphony Orchestras. And here in Charlottesville, you probably know her as co-founder and artistic director of Victory Hall Opera, a singer-led opera company, which is currently presenting its 5th, slightly different as all of our seasons are, 5th season of innovative and inventive productions of operas, old and new. Victory Hall Opera is wonderful. So welcome to you, Miriam. So we have an amazing group of musicians here with us today, and thank you all for joining us. I think it's clear to most of us that classical music is a place that has long prioritized the interests, the creative activities of people who look like me, which is to say white and male. And from the stage to the conductor's podium, in our music textbooks, in our conservatories, on our repertoire lists, on our boards of directors, and yes, on our radio stations, over and over again, we see this long tradition of classical music is often a place where the power and influence of white men are assumed and a kind of status quo. And in one of the blurbs for this panel, we asked, what will it take to break the grip of long deceased white European men on the public's perception of classical music? And I think there certainly is a perception that classical music is less diverse than our nation and our world at large. But I wanted to start today with the first question to each of you. As artists with really rich and varied careers doing all sorts of different things, I kind of wanted to ask you what you see as the reality on the ground right now in classical music in regards to racial and gender inequality. What has been your experience as things are today? In your experience, is classical music this white male dominated space that it does seem to be? And so I guess I wanted to start with Reggie.
Thank you, Brian. I think we saw something happen, it kind of as a reflection off of something that, something terrible that happened. Obviously, this summer saw the brutal murders of several Black people in America by our systemic through systemic racism. And because of that, because of seeing this happen at a time during a quarantine, during a shutdown, when everything should be different, where everyone should be looking out for each other, where everything should be calmer, we still saw that Black people still aren't necessarily safe in this country, and it triggered an incredible response globally, and not just globally, but here at home with corporations, with arts organizations, with politicians, with just everyone stood up and noticed. Because of that, it seemed like arts organizations in particular took this chance to actually reflect and see that we have not, as a community, created a safe space for people that look like me. And that because of that, we kind of realize that we haven't really done too much to help change the narrative from our own vantage point. And so arts organizations everywhere have been trying to put out, statements of solidarity with minorities, particularly Black people and communities of color, but also look at themselves and say, what have we done wrong? What have we not done to be more inclusive? Why is this area in music specifically, which of all the arts should be the most welcoming, should be the most inclusive, why aren't we? And so arts organizations have been looking at themselves and saying we need to make a change. And with the silver lining of this pandemic is no one's really working. So with this time that we're now beginning to really look at ourselves as organizations, all of us, and say, what can we do to set the stage for our new normal once we have a vaccine? What can we do to be more inclusive? How can we integrate these ideas now so that once we hit the ground running, the arts organization that will be is not what it was. That it will look like our country, it look like our nation, look like our community. The arts community should be blacker. There should be more color. It should be more queer. It should be more femme, and we should be more inclusive, and really be more welcoming, with all the various communities out there that we've kind of blocked out for so long because of what we've established as what canon is and should be. So I've seen that that's something that is changing. It was really heavy this summer. Since the temperature has cooled, that initiative has cooled as well a bit, and some are kind of going back to just business as usual. But there are quite a few organizations and quite a few individuals that have taken that torch and are still running with it. And I really do think that something new will happen after this point.
Wonderful, thank you, Reggie. I wonder if Miriam, if we could hear a little bit about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that we are at some, I hope that we are at something of a turning point. Particularly, I can speak, with most authority about the opera industry because that's my world. And I think that this past summer and the events that that have coincided with this time when everybody's out of work, like Reggie was saying, has led to a lot of rethinking about what the systemic problems are within our industry. And some of them are to do with racism. A lot of them are to do with misogyny as well. And those two things are certainly not mutually exclusive. What I hope is happening, though, is not just a questioning of how to be more inclusive in what exists, you know. I think that part of the problem that classical music has is that we assume that our world that has perpetuated through, you know, since the birth of classical music is a neutral experience, is a culture-free zone, which everybody can participate in. It's some kind of neutral experience, which of course it isn't, Brian, as you were saying in your introduction. It's a very white experience a lot of the time, a super male experience, and therefore not the kind of loam from which diverse art grows, right? So I think that in thinking about structure, we really need to think about the arts world as an ecosystem in which certain dominant plants, right? If we're talking about a natural ecosystem, there are dominant plants in this thing that are disallowing the existence of diverse and even native species. And to me, those kind of structures are going to lead to longevity in this moment, are going to extend this moment to something that can be fruitful, and that becomes more of a way of life for us as classical musicians, in terms of not just programming within our existing structures and our existing leaderships, but looking at, okay, what are the changes we need to make to this landscape that it supports a variety of life, that it grows a variety of life, that, you know, yes, we have, for example, you know, maybe we have the music theater or something that is the bright orange Virginia lily that grows anywhere and is super strong and bright and brightens everyone's day. But somewhere off in the darkness, we also have a little chamber opera that's like, you know, maybe the bleeding heart little flower that grows in the darkness, but sort of is this transcendent experience for those who glimpse at it, right? So I think that looking, you know, in terms of an ecosystem, something that can support everyone equally in their own little corners of the garden, in their own little corners of the world, is going to be crucial to making this a moment that extends.
Wonderful, yeah. And I'm going to loop Judith in here with maybe a slightly different perspective as a composer. I wonder how you're kind of seeing things now and thinking about these questions.
Well, it's certainly complicated. As someone who would probably not have wound up in music without having a lively educational system in kindergarten through high school, where I lived in Albany, New York, various places in New Jersey. And one of the things that I see is that because of the cuts of arts education in school, you don't have a way to get started. So we can't really just take, I mean, of course, all the points that have been made are important. We need to change programming, et cetera. But we also need to create audiences and give people the experience of whatever music. For instance, at UVA, I started a course in songwriting because there wasn't one. And we created songs ranging from blues traditions through all kinds of different popular traditions up through hip hop and beyond. And one of the things that I think was so exciting to see was as the students became more aware of what musical ideas were involved, they were able to work more with their imaginations to create things. So I think that on one side, we need to give people the tools. I mean, many people are not aware of the fact that fewer kids are learning instruments now. Pianos have been thrown out. I mean, of course, there are digital pianos, et cetera, but I think creating the opportunity to engage with music. When I was a kid and I heard classical music, I loved it. Nobody told me that that there should be some other repertoire that I was listening to. So I would hate to see that go by the wayside. On the other hand, as someone who was president of American Women Composers in, dare I say, 1989 to 93, I am astonishingly aware of how difficult it has been and is for contemporary composers to have their voices heard. It has been more difficult for women, for people of color, to have their voices heard, but it's been hard for everyone because of the rigidity of performing organizations. And I cannot tell you how many times presenters have said to me, we'd really like to perform your music, but no one wants to hear this contemporary music. I have a concert pianist friend of mine who was told when she was performing a concert recently, nothing after Mussorgsky, please. So it's just very hard to think about how we can go about changing those kinds of attitudes. I think Reggie's right, this is a great moment for it. And we're certainly seeing more repertoire lists. We're seeing more excitement and interest, but I think there's gotta be some way to make it more invitational. And I think Miriam is correct that having different kinds of performances, different venues, which many people have been doing for some time now. I'd like to draw people's attention to an organization that I'm very involved with and fond of called the International Alliance for Women in Music, IAWM.org. If you're interested in finding music by women, they have a fantastic website. And it includes women composers, performers, musicologists around the world. So I think that's a beautiful resource. And I think we need more such resources as we move forward. But I think there has been some movement prior to this year, but I also think that there's still going to be a ways to go. And I'm very concerned about the impact of the pandemic on all of our arts organizations. Who has the resources? I mean, look, the Met has put everyone on furlough. How do we deal with orchestras who don't have that kind of funding and individual performers, and not just in the classical music world? I have a nephew who's a DJ. He went from doing fine to having zero work. So this whole issue of how do we support, how do we nurture, and how do we help organizations make it through this period in order to come up with programming that is much more reflective of the diversity of our world today. So a few thoughts to chew on.
Yes, many thoughts. And I think you're absolutely right, Judith, that the pandemic complicates things in so many ways. It's a matter of survival, I mean, for a lot of people. And the changes that we're kind of talking about, I think, are essential for classical music, and they have been for a long time. And it can be a little hard to see how, when the kind of financial, the landscape of our current world is what it is, that you don't want institutions to kind of lose the focus, particularly in this moment, and to lose the kind of effort it's going to take, like institutionally, to actually enact change, which is different than just saying you want to change something. But one of the things I think Miriam touched on, and we've all touched on it in different ways, is that idea of there being an institutional response, but also this idea of kind of growing your own kind of musical world. And this is something I feel like I've seen and read from a lot of particularly musicians of color over the summer, which is that there's this desire to kind of build your own musical space when the spaces that you see don't reflect the values and things that you think need to be in music. And so I sort of wondered if that's something that the three of you have thought about in your own work, if that's something that you've enacted in your own professional musical lives. there's these kind of opportunities and ways to kind of build your own ecosystem, as it were. So Miriam, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, what you just described is basically the mission statement for Victory Hall Opera. Thanks. Yeah, we started Victory Hall Opera here in Charlottesville specifically for that reason, because singers in general, and I don't know, I'd be interested to hear if Reggie can attest to this as well, but singers in general are not called upon to lead within an industry that we know the most about. You know, it's that simple. In the opera world, opera companies are run by business people, conductors, directors, people with a wide range of, of unrelated skills. But they are, well, certainly when we started our company, a tiny minority were run by singers. Now, when you start to inject singers into leadership of opera at all levels and board representation and all sorts of other things, you have a certain amount of diversity built in. You certainly have diversity in terms of females, because the opera industry is awash with women who have probably like a 17th of the number of roles written for them as men do. So you have a lot of women with a high degree of training who are sort of scrabbling around the edges of the industry trying to get enough to keep going. But in doing so, gathering a lot of information and expertise on running opera companies. And you have, you know, the one great, singing is in many ways a really great democratizer in terms of access. So as Judith mentioned, you know, the piano's being thrown out. And I think that to become a classical pianist or violinist or, you know, string player, certainly, access to those kinds of instruments that very quickly become very expensive instruments as you get better and better, I mean, that's going to rule out a huge percentage of the population. It's a class issue at that point, if you have the luck to be in a town where there is a good teacher, right? However, singing is something that, whether or not, even without schools, most people have access to it somehow through church groups or through community choirs, or, you know, there's some access point to it, amateur theater, musicals, things like that. So, you know, the opera singers come from everywhere and look like everything. And that being true, the fact that we are not, you know, that the representation is so imbalanced on the stage, on the big stages in particular, indicates that somewhere along the line, that for singers in particular, that early access doesn't translate to later opportunity. So that's kind of where that focus should be. But going back to your original question, yeah, Victory Hall Opera started in order to put singers put the creative reins of an opera company in the hands of singers, to reimagine rehearsal processes so that singers have more of an input, to be able to create, to have the freedom to create the kind of art that we wanted to see, which we weren't seeing on many stages, frankly, and to create roles for our ensemble of singers that would allow them to bring their whole selves to the stage. So we have, you know, a very diverse ensemble. We create specific projects for them that will allow them to express themselves, to step on the stage as a Black man playing a Black man, for example, rather than in a traditional production which assumes European characters that happen to be secretly cast with Black people but don't tell anybody. So, you know, we are trying to rethink all of that in terms of representation, and had to start a company in order to do so.
Yeah, Reggie, I wonder if we could hear kind of your thoughts on this, this homegrown from the ground up as a way of kind of building the musical world that you want to participate in. Yeah.
Well, I've never really, you know, because I've mostly been, you know, a professional singer forward. I'm usually just, and as I'm not really, I wouldn't really call myself an opera singer. I'm more of a concert singer and recitist. Most of my work is in oratorio and solo work. And so I really don't ever have the time enough at home to really consider what that would look like as far as creating my own space. But I was kind of given the opportunity with the Handel and Haydn Society to do so. When they realized actually that when the Museum of African American History in 2013 asked H&H to partner with them to curate concerts to commemorate H&H's role in celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment in Boston, they realized that there were no Black people in the ensemble. There were no Black people in the choir. There were none behind the stage. But they remembered that I did sing before, and so they just a shot in the dark thought they would offer the opportunity to me. I'd never conducted or curated before in my life, but I love opportunities that might challenge me, and so I took it upon myself to take it. And because of that, I've been able to really bring all of my thoughts and ideas to H&H and actually have been able to help the ensemble, this 200-plus-year-old ensemble, innovate itself and grow and realize what it should be focusing on. Miriam raised an amazing point, talking about the fact that singers, singing is something that is accessible by everyone. I mean, there's a reason when you think about the fact that I only realized this now as you were talking, Miriam, that the earliest, purest form of what American music is, slave songs, it was singing. The earliest music we have as Americans is singing. They didn't have pianos and violins in the field. They had their voices. And it's because of that. I think that singing is at the base of who we are. Speaking our minds, sharing ideas and emotions is who we are. And it's important to know that if you do have a way to give that opportunity to someone, as it was given to me, a singer may have a chance, may have the ideas to help an ensemble or organization grow and innovate in ways that, a lawyer or a hedge fund manager would never understand. And so I think that's great. I think that's basically how I do things with H&H. Singing really is kind of was how I was able to get started and find my own space. And with that, I'm trying to use my role with H&H to actually use our space that we have to open it up wider to the community of Boston as a whole, to say that this isn't just us welcoming you in. All of you are us. An arts organization should be a part of the community it's in. We belong to Boston. Boston isn't just our home. And I think that should always be something that we strive towards.
Absolutely. I love that. I mean, yeah, it's easy enough to think of organizations that sort of act as if they're geographically neutral and in many ways neutral. And Miriam, you were saying that before, that word neutral is so often the default position of privilege, which is it doesn't see itself. It assumes its neutrality. But Judith, it's a little different for a composer. I mean, a composer in 2020 and in this century has to kind of make your own opportunities every day. I mean, so little is assumed or given to you. And I just wonder, if you could talk a little bit about.
I have a few thoughts about that. So when I was involved with American Women Composers, which has since been subsumed by this International Alliance for Women in Music, we started a concert series at the National Museum for Women in the Arts in DC, which took a lot of doing and is not currently happening. They've had various changes of administration, but it was a way to start creating some kind of focus on music by women. And I have to say, I have not infrequently been asked, well, how do you feel about having your music on programs of all women composers? I don't think men are ever asked how they feel about having their music performed on concerts by all men. And my stock answer to that is, I love working with wonderful performers. I'm happy to work, whoever they're programming. And I think that having a way to expand voices that are heard is super important. During the many years that I taught at UVA, we did a lot of outreach and a lot of work on programming. Of course, music by all kinds of different students. We brought in many different types of ensembles. And so that was one way. And I love collaborating. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of working as a composer, ranging from working with kids on a piece I did using the sounds of tape that is being ripped and played with in various different ways, to working with community organizations in many different locations. As far as working on my own, I think that one of the things that perhaps drew me to work in new technologies is the opportunity that gives you to be your own performer. And I want to add one other thing, because there are now so many options for creating music using relatively inexpensive means. So many kids have been drawn to using technology. And while on the one hand, that's wonderful, and I'm a stalwart supporter of it, I also think that the experience of making music, whatever you're using, you can use an inexpensive recorder. It doesn't have to, or you can use, as I did for many years growing up, an old upright piano. It does not have to be a super expensive option. And yes, it's correct that if you're a fine violinist, you're not going to be satisfied with a student violin, and it does become more costly, but there are also many people who have contributed to giving instruments to those who want them. So I think it's important to look wherever you can for collaboration. In this particular time, of course, doing it where you are, that is to bloom where you're planted, becomes ever more important. And I have been looking for ways, as Brian knows, to think about what we can do in our own community. And at the same time, I love working with community groups, with children's choruses, all kinds of different organizations. So one of the things that's been intriguing to me, although it's on the one hand frustrating to have performances via the screen, on the other hand, I've both attended and participated in performance that I would never have been able to do had I had to be there in person. And one ongoing project right now that is coming to fruition, that was postponed due to the pandemic. I had a piece commissioned by the San Jose Chamber Orchestra for string orchestra and electronics that are made from readings of and about the First Amendment. And I've just been working with the conductor who decided, we're not going to wait for the pandemic to be over. This is important now. And so she is working on doing the recording of the piece, and I'm working with a videographer on creating a video that will go with the performance on screen of the piece. And then down the road, we look forward to it being a live performance. But it's also been fascinating to now go back and look at so many different sources of thought about this very complicated issue. So I think it's really important to bloom where you're planted, but not to stop finding ways to collaborate with people in other places, which technology does afford us.
You know, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about something that I think all of you have touched on, which is education and training. You know, as musicians, of course, there's sort of a path that you in many ways more or less have to follow to kind of achieve at the level that you might want. I mean, and there is a kind of rigidity built into the system, and a word that's come up already is that word canon, which is something that a lot of people are examining these days, the kind of implicit, unsaid biases that exist in the canon. And so I wanted to kind of ask each of you maybe a little bit about your own experience coming to music, your own training, and maybe reflections upon the course that you took. Were there things that made it more challenging? Were there relationships, programs, opportunities along the way that made it rewarding, that kept you going? Yeah, that big pool of questions around arts education, which is, as you've all said, a reality. You know, it is training has to happen, and the way it happens really matters. And what we point to and listen to and learn about really matters. So maybe we'll start back with you, Reggie, there. That mouthful of a question.
Sure. I was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida, and I was I was raised by my grandparents, and they didn't like the only music that was allowed in the house as I was growing up was either gospel or jazz. And nothing else really. Like they considered classical music funny music, white music that we didn't listen to because that wasn't for us. And I sang in the church in my church choir growing up. I've stopped once I got into middle school. And in middle school, I actually, because I was too late to join the computer club, I joined the band because I didn't want to join the sports club. And so I looked at the instruments there and I picked the trumpet because I grew up listening to Louis Armstrong, and I share the same birthday with Dizzy Gillespie, so I've always loved the trumpet. And so I picked the trumpet and played that, and in the course of that first year we played a lot of like Baby Elephant Walk and Kokomo, and kind of like soft listening pop songs, but we also played an arrangement of a Bach prelude and fugue. And I don't know why it happened or what happened, but playing and hearing that fugue for the first time was literally life changing for me. And it was in a space that I didn't have to think about whether or not I was allowed to enjoy this, or it was just something that was there for me to discover and fall in love with. And I was insatiable from that point. I was at the public library every day, checking out every CD and cassette tape of Bach and things like that. And I remember finding a cassette of the English Concert with Trevor Pinnock with the Sixth Brandenburg Concerti. And I was just floored. I'd never heard anything like that before in my life. And from that point forward, I wanted to know more about classical music. And so it became a hobby. So it was either, if it wasn't jazz, it was Baroque music. If it wasn't Baroque music, it was jazz again. And it always stayed as a part of me. Even though through high school, my focus was art. My high school was a drafting and architecture magnet school, and that was the program I was in. And I was actually convinced my senior year to drop one of my AP art courses to pick up chorus, because high school choirs always need men. And the chorus teacher just, of course, heard me singing in the hallway and thought I should. And I fell in love with singing Purcell, with singing little octavos of whatever, barbershop songs that came. And I was just taken by it. And even though I received a full scholarship to Davidson College in North Carolina for art, I really realized that music was becoming more and more of a passion. And I thought that maybe, art's a long shot, so maybe music is an equal long shot, and I'm not afraid of the challenge, so I should try it anyway. And I was able to convince my mom and guidance counselor. We a last-ditch effort applied to an HBCU, Oakwood College in Huntsville, Alabama. And to my surprise, they accepted my application and matched my scholarship for music, for art. And so I went to college on a trumpet scholarship and never touched trumpet a single day. I immediately started taking voice lessons and went that route instead. But it was just, by chance hearing this music, I was completely taken by it. And I think that we shouldn't consider classical music as something that kids won't love at any age, at any level. This is something that if children hear music and they like it, they like it. They can't explain it, and they shouldn't have to. But if they love it, we should encourage that. And if they enjoy Kendrick Lamar more, if they enjoy Beyonce more, if they love, Billie Holiday, odds are they'll still love Bach, they'll still love Handel, they'll still love Mussorgsky, and and Julia Perry and Florence Price and whomever they hear and know. I mean, it's just important to just never patronize anyone at any level. Treat them all as someone who is open to the experience of music and what music can bring. And I think that my path has led me to believe in that completely.
That's beautiful. Judith, I wonder if I can rope you in here, some thoughts from you.
Well, first, let me just say how beautiful that was, Reggie. It was very touching. And I had, I think, a somewhat similar experience because I don't come from a family where there was music. My father was a clinical psychologist, and he was working with some musicians who said, "You have daughters, you should have a piano." So he went out and got an old upright, and I would run to it at 6 in the morning, and I just loved it. So eventually I was asked if I wanted lessons, and I just started that way. But I really, again, credit the public schools I went to in Albany, New York, and in Maplewood, New Jersey, where there were teachers who really were passionate about music. I sang in a chorus where we met for an hour at 7 in the morning because there was a teacher who cared and created that opportunity. And I was very fortunate that we had orchestras, and I learned to play flute at school. And we learned to read music in first grade in the school that I went to. So getting back to what Reggie was saying, creating the opportunities so kids have the possibility to fall in love with many different kinds of music. And I think that one of the issues that we have is, and I faced this many times with students at UVA, they simply hadn't had the opportunity to experience music that, I don't know what we want to call it, non-pop music, if you will. And so it really created many ear-opening experiences for them. So I think the educational piece is really important. Now, as far as music education goes, I went to Douglas College as an undergraduate, and the norm was for students who majored in music to give a senior recital. And I didn't want to give a senior recital as a pianist. So I had just really gotten into composing, and I marched into the chair's office and said, I want to do a senior recital in composition. And he was not very enthusiastic about this idea, but we ultimately came to an agreement that if I would play one of the pieces that I wrote, of course, create the music, find the performers, organize it all, they would let me do it. And I did, and I just loved it. I mean, it was, of course, difficult, and I was full of trepidation and worried about it, but there was so much joy in it. And I have to say, I so love working with performers, experimenting, trying things out. And so I never looked back from that point. It was just something that I wanted to do. Another really key experience for me was spending a summer right after college at the Aspen Music Festival and sitting in on all manner of master classes, including the singer Jan de Gaetani, who was just marvelous, and just hearing such a variety of music and contemporary music. People like George Crumb visited, and Yannis Xenakis. I will say then, and I will say now, they have certainly not done a good job about diversifying. They have done some music by women, precious little. And I think that the administration has been working to change that some. But I think that with so many institutions, these changes are just happening at a very slow rate. But I do want to say, and second what Reggie was saying, the marvel of the experience of music when you have that opportunity is something that I hope will continue to be available. And unfortunately, so many schools no longer have these kinds of programs. So how do we do it? How do we add it back? I mean, at the University of Virginia, the symphony has done a lot of work bringing in kids to experience concerts, Tuesday evening concerts. Many of our organizations do that, but it's not enough. It's too much of a one-time thing. It needs to be available in a more ongoing basis as kids are moving through school from an early age.
Lovely. And Miriam, we turn to you. Thoughts about your education, your introduction to music, education
Yeah.
in general. Yeah.
Well, I had a very different experience growing up in Australia. I was, but I was lucky enough, fellow flautist here from age 10 or so. I started learning the flute, and through that gained entrance to one of the two, I think, special interest music schools within my state. So I was studying music I was studying, sort of 7 or 8 units of music a week, from age 13, which was amazing. But what I see from the outside, I mean, I'm so envious of what you have here, or what we have here, in terms of, especially in singing, in terms of the range of opportunities like Aspen or like summer schools and summer training programs. And I see people in America, students getting who do get the bug, just as we all did. I got the bug similarly to Reggie the first time I heard opera live, which I was lucky enough to experience as a 13-year-old, going to see a Carmen, with my class, who all were sort of talking through the whole thing and not paying any attention, while I was absolutely riveted and walked out of that theater on air and never looked back, as just determined to become an opera singer. So I see that here, when that happens, there is a pathway to explore that further. Whereas in Australia, where that happened outside of my own school grounds, there was not an opportunity. There weren't those steps on the ladder. And I think that we're probably all saying the same thing about the importance of that, certainly in terms of becoming classical musicians. I mean, audiences and becoming musicians, I think, are related in terms of the ecosystem. But certainly for performers, which are going to lead to different kinds of products eventually, which are going to lead to different audiences, right? Diversity needs to be, encouraged and be given a ladder from those early, I got the bug, and now what? What is my next step? Because you only need to know what the next step is. You only need to know, well, now I can go to that teacher, or now I can audition for that program, or I can go to that summer school. And that's enough to keep people on the track and moving forward on the track and eventually getting where they need to go. But if any one of those rungs is missing, so if there's ever a moment where, like me, I mean, I liked my way through, but maybe someone like me who lived in a country town or something, who had that experience of hearing classical music because someone toured through their town, but from that point had no information about what the next step was, no one within the town to help them, no one to spot, no choir director to look at their face during that experience and say, "Ooh, there's something going on there. I'm going to make sure I take her aside and point out what she can do about this new passion," right? All of those steps are necessary. And if any of them get missed, the whole thing can come crashing down. It's not an easy thing to solve, but some of the solutions to all of these things, not just about education, but also about the homegrown product in particular, and blooming where you're planted, is that some of the solutions to that are not particularly sexy, right? And as people who work at WTJU, you understand the value of civic infrastructure, right? You understand, okay, this is this radio station that provides access for a wide range of people, to broadcast. And I think that civic infrastructure, certainly not going to, don't doze off while I'm talking about it, but it's something that's really missing from our town. And, if you are an independent musician, there are some really, really simple things that the city can provide that will enable you to create your own art easily and will enable you to gain an audience for it and inexpensively For example, we must be the only city in America that does not have a boring, built in the 70s, but functional civic arts center. You know, we do not have one. There's nowhere that kids grow up going to for something, right? To see a play or to see a concert that they then get used to going to, that then, you know, maybe they start to support once they get a job, or maybe they, you know, volunteer at in high school. We don't have that. We don't have a place that anybody can book for any reason, so long as they get on the schedule and pay the fee, you know. And these things, think about what that does. That means that if you want to find a cheap venue, you have to know someone in a church. You have to go to church, potentially problematic for a lot of people. You have to, you know, search up and, like we've done coming into this town, search up and down for places to perform that will let you in the door, and then reorganize everything that they're doing in order to create music. And it's such a stupid hurdle, you know. It's there's absolutely no reason for it. And I know art centers are difficult to build, but that's just one example, you know. Things like an arts organization that we used to have and no longer have, but you know, that is a meeting place for all of these activities, and a place for us all to share information about what we're doing, and a central marketing force for all of us. All of these things are not sexy, but are really important solutions to creating homegrown art.
No, I love it. I mean, I think that's wonderful. And right, it might not be sexy, but it is a large question, and all this, the kind of civic and kind of, you know, national kind of pulling back from being involved in these things, especially in America. You know, this is not a problem that exists to that degree in other countries, but it has a lot to do with kind of how hard and how alien it might seem to so many people to even consider a career in the arts or pursue a passion. But we only have a few minutes left, and we do have a question in chat that I want to kind of, it's a little tonally different, but I want to kind of get to it because I think it's a good question. Mary Garner asks, she says, I'd love to get some recommendations from you all. Who are some artists, groups, composers that you all love and that you think deserve more attention? So presumably not Beethoven with that question. But how about Reggie? Start with you, I think.
I'll just give you two recommendations. The first is Isabella Leonarda, who was a Ursuline nun from the 17th, 18th century. She composed well and published well over 200 pieces. She was the most prolific female composer in the 17th, 18th century. She was a Mother Superior, and was the first female women composer to actually write and publish a solo concerto. Sonata for violin. And her music is unbelievable. It's worth delving into. It's some of the most charming, some of the most incredible stuff that exists in that period, and it's definitely amazing. And also, this is her 400th anniversary this year. She was born in 1620, so it's 2020. Despite all the terrible things, we do still get to celebrate her 400th anniversary, and of course the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment for the women in the right to vote, which is why my second recommendation is Florence Price, who is an unbelievable Black female composer who studied here in Boston from Arkansas. She was the first Black female to have a composition performed by Chicago Symphony. She had works performed here in Boston by BSO, and Helen Hayden has performed her works. And she is such an incredible and versatile composer that I could talk forever about how I think a lot of what was missed in us embracing slave songs and Negro spirituals as American music and as canon is kind of fulfilled through her. And to me, I think she is the backbone or the figurehead of what American classical canon is and should be in this country. So those two are incredible and should be known and should be household names.
Definitely second that. Judith, if you have any thoughts, artists, groups, composers who could use a little more attention.
So I certainly agree with Reggie's ideas. I think that one composer who I would like to recommend, because I think her music is wonderfully colorful, many diverse ensembles have performed it, is the violinist and composer, although certainly more composer than violinist these days, Ellen Tate-Zwillich, Z-W-I-L-I-C-H. I first got to know Ellen many years ago because she was actually the first woman to do a doctorate at the Juilliard School. And I've been impressed by how many different kinds of groups she's worked with and just the imagination in her music. And I think it's quite accessible music that a lot of people would enjoy. I'm going to mention one other composer whose work engages with new technologies and extended techniques in beautiful ways, and that is Kaija Saariaho, who is a Finnish composer currently living in Paris. She has composed opera and many vocal pieces, but also chamber and orchestral work. And I think she integrates new technologies very beautifully with more traditional ensembles. So there's two for you, and I'm going to mute that.
Thank you, Judith. And we turn to you, Miriam.
Well, I have to do a shout out for one of my favorite Australian composers, whose name was Margaret Sutherland. Used to wrote some absolutely beautiful song repertoire. Also, some of it is quite, well, in terms of vocally, if anyone is ever looking for repertoire to teach younger singers, it's really perfect for that. But it's also got some really complex poetry by some, she set a lot of war poetry from one of the, probably the great Australian war poet, whose name is John Nelson Shaw. So love Margaret Sutherland. In terms of American composers, I would also check out the work of Sue Lyan Tan, who is also an incredible vocal writer with a lot of spunk and a lot of sort of 80s pop influence. She's based out at Middlebury College in Vermont, and she's great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you. I see that we are just now at 5 o'clock, so I think we're going to have to wrap things up there. But I want to say thank you to each of our panelists for spending this hour with us and sharing your thoughts and ideas and experiences. And thank everyone who came, and we look forward to seeing you again. And if you are so inclined, tune into the classical marathon here in WTJU starting on Monday morning. It's going to be an amazing week, and we're certainly going to hear some of the composers that you all just mentioned. So be sure to tune in, and thank you all so much again. Take care.